Welcome everyone to another episode of Equals. Welcome from a beautiful day here in Nairobi. In fact, you can hear the birds chirping in the background. And this is our Valentine Special. This is Nabil.
This is Max. Yeah, this is the Valentine Special. This is when we start the experiment of bringing romance into the podcast.
And what a pleasure, Mr. Lawson, it is to do this Valentine Special with you.
Yes, it's always romantic to hang around with you, Nabil.
But really, we're going to be speaking to two fantastic activists today. Two activists who found their love on the front lines.
Yeah, two activists who met on the barricades, and they're not the only ones, are they, Nabil?
Oh, well, Max, I did meet the lady who became my wife, fighting far-right, fighting fascism, actually, on student campuses in the UK. But mine's not the only activism love story here, is it?
Yeah, I met my wife. I was chairing a committee meeting that she attended, which was very romantic.
Chairing? Romantic?
Yeah, well, you clearly haven't seen me chair.
Okay, so really today we're going to be speaking to two fantastic activists. They are Njoki, Njehu, and Soren Ambrose. Let me introduce Njoki first. Njoki leads work to fight inequality across the African continent. She also leads Daughters of Mumbi, a Kenyan national NGO that's all about fighting gender-based violence and fighting for women's land rights.
And Soren, her husband, is a key thinker in this business. He's someone that's influenced me heavily over the years, and he's the head of policy at ActionAid, the international NGO.
And Njoki and Soren, they met, a couple of decades ago as part of the 50 Years is Enough campaign, which was all about, taking on the IMF and the World Bank?
Not just taking them on, abolishing them. So 50 years since the IMF and the World Bank were formed, it was time to close them.
Goodness me. And I understand, Max, you used to be very scared of Njoki.
Really scared of Njoki and pretty scared of Soren as well, to be honest. I think it's fair to say we were often on opposite sides of debates in those days.
Well, nothing a cup of tea and a podcast interview can't solve, eh?
It was a lovely interview, and they're such a fantastic couple.
Brilliant. Let's get to it. Njoki, Soren, thank you very much for inviting us into your home on this pleasant Nairobi evening. And thanks for joining Equals.
Thanks for having us. We're excited to do this.
We're hearing today your amazing individual stories of activism, but there's obviously you're coming together as activists as well.
Right.
And really being there for one another on the front line. I'm interested to hear, as we are in our Valentine Special, how did it all come together? Where did you meet? How did it work out?
Oh my God. We met in a meeting of the 50 Years is Enough campaign. Soren had moved from Chicago to DC. And we used to have steering group meetings where we would have a speakerphone. There was no Skype back then.
Yeah, no internet.
So we would have a speakerphone that people would call into, and so while we were waiting, I think
so Njoki and I were the first ones to the meeting. We were both early, and
Njoki was early.
I'm not sure, but I do think it was the last time she was early for a meeting.
Oh my God!
And if I recall correctly, it's because she got the time wrong.
Yeah, that would explain it.
Go ahead, besmirch my name. But anyway, we got talking, and then after the call, Soren mentioned that he had just moved to DC, and that the day before had been his birthday. And I'm really big on celebrating birthdays. So it was like, so what did you do for your birthday? It's like, this is now in a conversation with everybody. It's like, nothing. I didn't know anyone here. And we were, oh no, we must all go for a drink. And we went to the Washington Post pub, which was around the corner from where the 50 Years is Enough office. And as I was leaving, I gave Soren my number because part of it was that I knew what it was like to move into a new city where you didn't know anyone. But I also just want to say that I think for me, having a partner, a spouse who really great support and understanding and because I think sometimes in relationship there's tension because you bring your work home or someone or the other person brings their work home and there's not an understanding of what it's about. But my crunch time is often his crunch time. That I think is one of the things that I really appreciate about being married now, 23 years?
And I think we
son.
complement each other well in that I'm a bit of an introvert, and Njoki, if you haven't already figured it out, is more outgoing. So, Njoki does the speaking, does the community relations, and I kind of figure out what's going on policy-wise. And that's how it worked at 50 years. And sometimes that's still the character it takes on. Certainly, I haven't gotten any less introverted since we met.
Just recently, the former president of Kenya for many years, President Moi, died. And Njoki, I think I'm right in saying that your upbringing, and particularly your mum, you suffered considerably under. Your mum was very close, worked really closely with Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Prize winner, environmentalist. I know you were really involved in that, weren't you?
So my mom was very involved with the Greenbelt movement and with Wangari Maathai from the very beginning. And as the Moi government came down hard on Wangari and on the Greenbelt movement, there were all these other people who were in line. So, for instance, when Wangari was arrested and hurt in prison, in jail, and ended up in the hospital, my mother, they paid for my mother to be in the next bed with her. And as she says, she left to go into that bed having said her goodbyes, not knowing whether she would come home or not, because, there had been experiences of people being disappeared, being killed, and all of that. One of the very well-known politicians, opposition politicians, Kenneth Matiba, actually had a stroke because they were detaining him. He had a stroke. They didn't treat him, and it completely, I think they said for a week they did not give him any treatment for the stroke that he had, and of course that had lasting impact on his health. So, but yeah, Moi has died this week, and there's a lot of whitewashing of his legacy, and of there's this video that everybody keeps playing where he says in 2012, if I ever did anything, if you have insulted me, I forgive you, and if I've said anything to hurt you, also please forgive me. But the truth of the matter is that he did more than just say things that hurt people. In fact, if he wants, I have said, and I've written about this on social media, if he wants to be forgiven, and if the people who are supporting him and kind of putting this alternative story about who he was and what he did for this country, if they want to do that, they need to embrace his whole
legacy.
His whole legacy. People in this country lived in terror. You would get into a matatu, which is something that the millennials can't understand. You would get into a matatu and nobody would talk. People literally believed that anything you said would get to Moi, like in the next, 5 minutes or something. I don't even know. There were rules about how many people could be together. Unless it was a funeral or wedding, you were not allowed to have more than 8 people together without a permit. So it's all kinds of things. Soren talked about when we came in 1997 and we had gotten married in the US. Neither of my parents had been able to come. So we were having this luncheon that ended up having I don't know, how many people do you think there were?
200?
Like 200 people at my parents. And I later came to understand there had been a conversation about whether they needed to get permission, from the chief to have this, because it wasn't exactly a wedding, right? Like it didn't
it was like
fit.
a reception.
It was more like a reception, and at that reception was Wangari Maathai and the then member of parliament for my constituency, who was a family friend, extended family member, Paul Moite, who was like the lead lawyer who represented a lot of the people who.
I thought they decided he shouldn't come.
He was supposed to come. In the conversation is when they decided that he shouldn't come. So,
because if they had 2 prominent people,
yes, then
it would draw more attention.
Yeah, but that was the Kenya that we.
That's how it was in those days.
No, it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. Let me add and also say that as part of that, it literally, it was like being on call 24 hours, 24/7. because, Wangari could be arrested, or, anything, raids would happen, so you had to make sure that before somebody gets grabbed and disappeared, that you have raised the alarm. So I had, Bella Abzug, who was a very well-known feminist leader in the U.S. with We Do, Women's Environment and Development Organization. I had Al Gore's number. I had all these numbers of people where I would get a phone call, sometimes in my dorm room at some, for part of that time I was in college, I would get that call. And then I would make a call or a couple calls and get things rolling. So, I remember the one time when they were trying to arrest Wangari, and there was like 200 police officers outside her house in South Sea. Like, they had come to arrest this woman. She was barricaded in the house. So I get the phone call, and I remember Al Gore, then he was Senator Gore, making a speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate and saying this was happening now. And it was the one way in which to ensure that, she didn't get arrested, disappeared, and never heard from.
So let me take this from the top, like by winding the clock back now, 25 years, in what seemed to be a very exciting period for activism in reading about you. These days we're trying to reform the IMF and the World Bank, trying to influence it. But am I right, you were trying to take them down altogether?
Yeah, no, the 50 Years is Enough campaign was a campaign that around the 50th anniversary of the World Bank and the IMF were saying a little bit like what we've been saying about abolishing billionaires, that you can't afford these institutions. They are harmful. Their track record has not been that great. Everybody listens to them. Everybody thinks that they're the smartest and have the best. They have the best economic advice, but that our world was not and still is not doing so well economically, in spite of their advice to countries, to every single country in the world. So this 50 Years is Enough campaign started in 94, or a little bit before that, but it was actually building on years of campaigning on debt, on structural adjustment programs, on cuts in education and in health, and the environment.
Lot of big dams.
Yeah. There was a lot of the big dams that the World Bank had been building all over, where communities were being drowned out, people were being forced out, and all of that. So it was really coming together of campaigners in communities and people in northern countries working to get their governments, to do the right thing.
And there were a lot, well, maybe not 96, but a little bit later, there were really significant protests against the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, paint a picture for us. I mean, there were thousands of people used to turn up to demonstrate.
Yeah. I think the sort of the height of it, coming from Seattle in November 1999, there was real momentum, and in April 2000, we had more than 30,000 people, show up to demonstrate against the World Bank and the IMF, which was much broader in terms of the participation of people from all over. It was quite exciting times.
But let's be clear, in the late 90s, we had many demonstrations of 25 or 50 people in front of the IMF as well.
So it wasn't all 30.
No.
This is a reality check.
This took a while to build. And the Jubilee campaign that was global, or going global at that time, was a big part of that. But it's important to say that the environmental movement was a bulwark of the movement against the World Bank in particular. And at the same time, we have to remember at that time, trade was a very big concern. With the Bretton Woods Conference, where the World Bank and IMF were founded in 1944, there was a proposal for an international trade organization as the third of those institutions. American, opposition in the U.S. Congress put an end to that idea until 1995, when the WTO was formed from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT.
And Soren and Njoki, I'm very interested to hear that you said it started out with 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 people outside the IMF and the World Bank. What is it that you saw that grew that protest movement into the 1,000, into cities worldwide, into what was a global campaign that eventually won successes with governments?
Well, I think there was a lot of organizing that happened. The 50 Years is Enough campaign was interesting in that even in the US, there were chapters. But I think that there was also a real, one of the strongest arms of the 50 Years is Enough campaign was the Catholic social justice organizations. And, there was,
Catholic.
there was even something called the Religious Working Group on the World Bank and the IMF. And one of my favorite stories was a campaign that they did when on debt it was said that it would cost Americans pennies to the dollar to cancel debt. And so there was this campaign, the idea that let us send pennies to the U.S. Treasury to tell them, here are my pennies, cancel the debt. And the U.S. Treasury called the chair of the Religious Working Group on the World Bank and IMF and said, tell them to stop sending us pennies. Because by law, they actually had to count and acknowledge these pennies that they were getting from people across the U.S. And they had to acknowledge, count, and account for them. We did speaking tours. I traveled a lot speaking in church basements and union halls and college campuses. It was quite amazing.
The whole idea of economic justice in the United States was really kept alive by those religious movements, yes, but also by the Central America Solidarity organizations, which I know there were many internationally, but in the U.S. it was particularly big because, of course, it was the U.S. that was the real bad actor in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The 50 Years campaign was actually founded by, NGOs in Washington and the Bay Area, Friends of the Earth, Development Gap, International Rivers Network. But it was the mobilization came and it became a network when we reached out to all these other groups, and that's where the real energy came from, and we were able to go beyond. And to return to your earlier question, Max, what really kind of tipped the scales from the time when we were 100 people marching in a circle around the IMF to having thousands, it probably really came with Seattle, to be honest, and the involvement of the trade union movements. And just to add another contrast, quite a contrast in some ways, another pillar of the movement that we shouldn't forget, even though it wasn't always easy, was the anarchists. And in the U.S., I often thought that when they scheduled the WTO meetings in Seattle, like they were trying to sabotage them, because Seattle was a very strong union city. It was the biggest city where a lot of the forest activism was going on. The anarchist movements we worked with, we would labor to create agreements on how we would work together, because everything is process and with them.
It's quite hard to work with an anarchist.
It can be,
in my experience.
It can be, but they were invaluable allies, and they were ideologically very clear on what they were doing. Even those who practiced what we came to call property destruction on the streets of Seattle were doing so with a very thought out idea of why they were doing it. It wasn't vandalism in the ordinary sense.
Soren, I enjoyed geeking up, learning about you and the crazy things you've said over the years and done. But one thing I was really interested in reading about was something that Naomi Klein actually wrote in The Nation, and she was talking about 2001 in Porto Alegre, when you, Naomi Klein, many other activists around the world come together for the first World Social Forum. You talk about how it's the coming out party for the existence of serious thinking about alternatives. Was this? Do you look at this time as a real kind of peak in recent activism?
No, I mean, the World Social Forum was an incredibly exciting idea because it was going to be all of the progressive and radical political groups, the only rule was that you couldn't support armed violence in your political beliefs. And of course, we weren't trying to get the right wing involved. But all of these groups coming together with translation, however good or bad it actually ended up being, in one place to discuss these ideas. I mean, there was an elaborate structure, which in the end nobody really understood. It was all these Brazilian intellectuals putting it together. But the spirit was amazing. And we had people from around the world. And this first World Social Forum was, we were deliberately challenging Davos. It was held at the same time as the World Economic Forum, as it was for many years after that.
Yes, and the World Social Forum, taking place at the same time as Davos, taking on Davos, is a real inspiration to the work of the Fight Inequality Alliance today and the global week of protest against inequality that takes place during Davos. So the World Social Forum is a real inspiration. So listen, guys, let me ask you, be honest, do you think over the years you might have mellowed just a bit?
Soren, you don't seem to have mellowed.
Well, no, I think probably temperamentally I have. No, in fact, I'll confess it's when it became 75 years of the IMF and World Bank, and I realized I had joined that campaign in 1994, 25 years beforehand. It's not a great feeling. I do think the institutions have slowly evolved. The IMF now says things we couldn't imagine them saying. They don't do things differently, but they say things.
The problem is that they're not held accountable.
Well,
and I think that continues to really bother me.
On my first trip to Kenya with Njoki in 1997, after we got married, we were coming here and trying to do presentations to community groups and to young activists in Nairobi about debt specifically. And Njoki had to kind of relearn how to, learn how to talk about those concepts in a different language to talk to some of the community groups she talked to. But I do remember talking to some of the young people we were talking to then. And what they said to us was, we don't want that debt canceled. We want the president to have to pay that debt back. And we really labored to make the case that it wasn't the president who was going to be paying back that debt. But the emotional feel of people about this was that the accountability of their own government was being eroded when we talked about the IMF and the World Bank as the baddies.
And in a country like Kenya, where the narrative of corruption is very, very strong and carries a lot of weight, to get people to understand that there's a lot more going on, that when you go to Kenyatta National Hospital and there are no medicines and there are no doctors or nurses, or that people are sleeping to a bed, that there is an element of corruption, yes, but there's also this thing that where the World Bank and the IMF in particular was limiting what countries could spend on health and what they could spend on education. And so
especially hiring public sector.
Yeah, and all this came actually kind of wide open in Uganda, where Uganda is fighting the HIV pandemic. They get money from the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and malaria, and the IMF says you can't take the money. And by the way, all the policy papers, all the demonstrations, all the things that we had ever done to remove user fees had not worked. That was the moment where, you had all of these people who in the US Congress who said they cared about HIV AIDS, and here the IMF was saying no. And for the first time, the US Congress had these, hearings. I was one of the people who testified on the civil society side, and the U.S. executive directors at the World Bank and the IMF were instructed by Congress to oppose any policies or any projects that would include user fees for health and education.
So Soren and Njoki, we've heard so much inspiring stuff here from those years, from the battles you won, from how you came together. It seems actually you're kind of repeating stuff that we're trying to figure out today that you accomplished back then. I'm really keen to hear, as two seasoned activists, what's your advice to young people today? And especially, where do you find hope with all the turmoil we see around the world?
Well, I think for me as an activist, actually hope is the thing that is in abundance. Whether you're looking at the climate strikes, whether you're looking at the Fight Inequality Alliance, whether you're looking at the ways here in Kenya, young people are organizing against extrajudicial killings, women are organizing against sexual and gender-based violence, and communities are fighting for their rights. There's a great deal of hope for me in the activism that people do, and I get a lot of inspiration from that. And I think for young people, I would say, find something that you believe in and really fight for it. One, learn. I think that one of the things that the millennials often are chided for and criticized for is that there's often this attitude that nobody has done anything, and maybe not the way they're doing it, maybe not through social media and all of that, but to really listen and learn and read to see what other people have done, and build the movement, because alone you cannot do it.
So I have a modicum of hope, but I do think that the biggest challenge that the world faces by far is the climate crisis, and it's very hard for me to be optimistic about humanity's capacity to think beyond 10 years ahead in order to actually take the steps. And I think that's been proven for the last 30 or 40 years in regards to the climate. So it's a daily struggle. But seeing people mobilized in the U.S. in a way that in the political system that simply wasn't happening when I lived in the U.S. I mean, it happened a bit in the 60s, but it was mostly against the political system. Now people are working within the political system and really trying to take it back from the corporate interests that have dominated both of the two big parties there. So I do find that. I find the rhetoric encouraging. It's still a lot of ground left to cover to get to where we need to, but things have opened up in a way that I simply couldn't conceive at the time that we left the U.S. in 2005.
Yeah, so let me close by saying thanks. That was a fascinating interview, and I learned a lot about both of you. I've known you both for the best part of 20 years, but that was really good and great to hear from you. Thanks for opening up and telling us about your lives, because I think it's so important. I agree with you completely on history. I think millennials like Nabil have got no concept.
All right.
Not interested in the past, so I think it's important that they learn. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was fun.
No, thank you for...
Thank you very much for welcoming us into your home and sharing this with us.
Anytime.
Well, Max, I've got my notepad out here. We covered a lot of ground, didn't we, with Njoki and Soren? We went from taking on debt in low-income countries to taking on dictators. We went from Seattle to communities here in Kenya. I'm pretty sure that sparked a few memories for you.
Oh, certainly, amazing interview. The memories of the protests outside the World Bank and the IMF, tens of thousands of people, and the organisation that went in behind that. Hearing the backstory for me was really interesting.
And hearing the backstory as well of building broad coalitions, building literal broad churches, right? Because you've got the nuns on one side and you've got the anarchists on the other. That sounds pretty broad to me.
Yeah, I mean, over the years, I've worked with anarchist groups, I've worked with the church, and I know from experience that bringing together such a disparate group behind a common cause, a common set of demands, that is no small achievement. No,
and there's definitely a lot, especially a lot for my generation of millennials to learn. But let me tell you, Max, I do feel millennials got a little bit of a beating in that interview.
You were outnumbered, it's true.
As a sole representative here of the millennial generation worldwide, I got to say there's some good things going on around the world, and we've got some fantastic people on our... Look at AOC, look at Beth. that we interviewed a few podcast interviews ago. There's some pretty good things happening thanks to millennials.
You're certainly doing a lot better than my generation.
I mean, who have you got? What did you know?
No one springs to mind, but I mean, I have huge respect for the generation of today and the risks they're taking around the world, from Lebanon to Chile, all over the world fighting inequality. So I think it is a truly inspiring times that we're living in, which is what Njoki said.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we do have to learn. We do have to look what others have done. I mean, I really, really found profound that point that Njoki made. You know, there is this superhero culture that exists within activism that thinks that it's just about me, that change comes down to my work. But actually, we do need to fight that individualism that exists within activism itself, don't we?
Absolutely. We have to move beyond individualism to the collective and move beyond individual causes to common causes. Often people get into activism fighting for a particular thing, fighting police killings, fighting gender-based violence. But it's about that step where you move beyond that and you find common cause with others. That's when you really start to make a difference.
Absolutely. And Njoki, Soren, if you're listening, let me say a huge thanks again for joining us on Equals and immense solidarity with all that you're doing. Our next interview is a really exciting one. We're talking to an academic who's a kick-ass academic who's worrying billionaires around the world.
Yeah, Gabriel Zuckman, who's just published with Emmanuel Saez a fantastic book, The Triumph of Injustice, which looks at slavery, it looks at taxation, it looks at abolishing billionaires. Is really inspiring, and it's making real waves in the US in particular.
Brilliant. We really look forward to that. Look forward to you joining us next time. So this is part of the interview where I ask you to do subscribe to the podcast, do share it with your family, with your friends. And for the first time, I'm going to ask you to please give us a solid review, at least 4 stars.
I think by solid we mean 4, possibly 5 stars.
Do join us next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.